The station cafeteria was never quiet, only selectively loud. Conversations overlapped like badly synchronized transmissions, trays clattered against metal rails, and the air carried a confused blend of spices, recycled oxygen, and impatience. It was the kind of place people pass through without really being there, focused on schedules, warnings, and the next thing that would demand their attention. I sat alone at a narrow table near the viewport, counting the minutes of my break with the slow seriousness of someone who knew those minutes mattered. My lunch sat in front of me, simple and unremarkable, wrapped in thin heat paper that had already begun to cool. Protein strips, grain paste, something that claimed to be fruit. Nothing worth guarding, nothing worth noticing. That was when she sat down, not across from me, beside me. No greeting, no request. Just the quiet certainty of someone who knew the space would be available. The bench shifted slightly under her weight, and for reasons I couldn't explain, the noise of the cafeteria seemed to dim around us, not disappearing but pulling back, like a tide reconsidering the shore. I glanced sideways. At first she looked human. Dark hair pulled back with careless precision, skin marked by the faint sheen common to anyone who'd spent time under artificial suns. Her posture was calm, composed, almost relaxed, but there was a stillness to her that didn't belong to crowded places. Then I noticed her ears. Long, elegant, subtle enough that your eyes slid past them unless you were paying attention. I looked away immediately, the way people do when they're unsure whether they've seen something they're supposed to pretend doesn't exist. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Seconds passed, maybe longer. The silence stretched, not awkward, just present. I told myself she was waiting for someone else, that I was incidental, a piece of furniture she'd mistaken for useful. Then her gaze shifted, not to my face, but to the food in front of me. "You will not finish that," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and carried an accent I couldn't place. Not regional, not planetary, more like a decision made about how words should sound. I blinked. "I usually do," I replied, because it felt important to establish that my eating habits were not a matter for public debate. She tilted her head slightly, considering. "Today, you will not." There was no challenge in her tone. No demand, just certainty. I frowned at my lunch, then back at her. "Do you have insider information on my appetite?" For the first time, something like amusement crossed her face. It was faint, restrained, as if she'd learned expressions the way one learns a language they don't intend to speak often. "No," she said, "but you are watching the viewport instead of your meal." I glanced at the glass without meaning to. Beyond it, the stars stretched in their usual indifferent sprawl, traffic lanes marked by distant pulses of light. Ships arrived and departed with practiced efficiency, each one carrying stories that would never intersect with mine. She was right, I wasn't hungry. "Observation," I muttered, "dangerous habit." "Yes," she agreed, "it is." Another pause, longer this time. I became uncomfortably aware of the fact that she hadn't ordered anything. No tray, no cup. Just empty space in front of her, as if nourishment were optional. "You waiting for someone?" I asked. "No." "Then why?" "I am early," she said, cutting in gently. "And you are available." I let out a short laugh before I could stop myself. That's one way to put it. Her eyes shifted to me then, fully this time. They were dark, reflective, holding depth rather than color. The kind of eyes that made you feel examined without being judged. I found myself sitting straighter without deciding to. "I have observed humans," she said. "You attach meaning to small gestures." "Sometimes," I said. "Usually when we're bored." She considered this. "Boredom creates honesty." I snorted. "That's optimistic." Her gaze dropped again to my lunch. The paper crinkled slightly as I adjusted it, an unconscious defensive gesture. She noticed. "Of course she did. You may keep it," she said, "if you prefer." Something in her tone suggested the opposite, that keeping it would be the stranger choice. I looked at the food, looked at her. Then, without quite knowing why, I slid the tray a few centimeters in her direction. "I wasn't going to finish it anyway," I said. "Occupational hazard of staring into space." She didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she studied me as if this small movement had confirmed something she'd been testing. Then, carefully, she touched the edge of the tray. "Thank you," she said. The words carried weight far beyond their simplicity. Not gratitude exactly. Recognition. She took a small portion, precise and measured, as though consumption itself followed rules I didn't know. I watched her take a bite, half expecting some visible reaction, surprise, distaste, anything. There was none. "It is sufficient," she said. "That's the cafeteria motto," I replied, "printed somewhere probably." This time her amusement was clearer, brief but real. We ate, or rather, I watched her eat for a while in silence. Around us, the cafeteria noise slowly returned to normal levels, conversations rising and falling, someone laughing too loudly at a joke that didn't deserve it. Yet the space between us remained oddly insulated. "Are you from around here?" I asked eventually. She paused, then answered no. "Far, yes." I nodded, accepting that this was as much detail as I was going to get. "Passing through." "In a manner of speaking." I leaned back slightly. "You talk like someone who's very careful with promises." She met my eyes again. "Promises are expensive." I felt a flicker of unease then, small but insistent. There was something about her calm that didn't belong to travelers or drifters. It belonged to people who knew outcomes before they happened. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She inclined her head, permission. "Why me?" For the first time since she'd sat down, she hesitated. "Not long, just enough to matter." "Because you did not ask what I was," she said. "Only who I might be." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I wasn't sure how to respond to that without sounding like an idiot. Before I could try, a low vibration passed through the station. Subtle, almost unnoticeable. The viewport lights dimmed for a fraction of a second, then steadied. Around us, people paused, frowned, and moved on. She felt it more clearly. I saw it in the way her shoulders squared, in the way her attention sharpened. "It is time," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked. She stood. The bench shifted back into place as if relieved. She looked down at me, and for a moment I had the irrational sense that the stars beyond the viewport were listening. "For consequences," she said. Then she turned and walked away, leaving my half-eaten lunch behind. I sat there long after she disappeared into the crowd, staring at the rest of my break dissolved without ceremony. I didn't notice the passing of time until the cafeteria lights shifted subtly, signaling a change in rotation, and an automated system cleared my tray with professional indifference. The woman was gone. No trace of her remained, not even the faint distortion I had felt when she sat beside me. The bench had returned to being just another surface designed for bodies, not meaning. I stayed seated longer than necessary, staring through the viewport as if the stars might rearrange themselves again just to confirm I hadn't imagined it. They didn't. They never did things on command. That, I realized, was precisely why her certainty had unsettled me. Eventually, routine reclaimed me. Work demanded attention the way it always did, quietly, persistently, with no regard for personal revelations. I walked back to my station, past familiar faces that didn't look back, and sat before panels that responded to touch without curiosity. Numbers scrolled. Indicators blinked. Systems reported normal operation. Everything was normal. That was the problem. I caught myself replaying the moment I slid the tray toward her. Not the act itself, but the impulse behind it. There had been no calculation, no expectation of return. Just a brief, unremarkable decision to give something away because it seemed appropriate, necessary even. You acted without expectation. The words lingered, unspoken but heavy. My supervisor passed behind me, paused, then moved on without comment. The overhead lights brightened by a fraction, then dimmed again. I checked the logs automatically. No recorded fluctuation. The station, apparently, had decided not to remember what I felt. By the time my shift ended, I was tired in a way sleep didn't usually fix. The station corridors felt longer, their curves more deliberate, as though I were walking through a place that had quietly adjusted itself around new assumptions. Doors opened just before I reached them. Transit indicators updated early. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make coincidence start feeling crowded. On the mag-lift platform, I stood among strangers pretending not to notice one another. The lift arrived with unusual smoothness, its deceleration precise to the point of elegance. As we ascended, I felt a brief pressure change, light and exact, like a system correcting for variables I couldn't see. A woman across from me frowned. "That felt different," she said to no one in particular. "Maintenance cycle," someone replied. The explanation was accepted immediately. People liked answers that closed doors. My apartment greeted me with its familiar narrowness. One room, one window, one heater that had never once respected my authority. Until now. The heater clicked on without protest, warmth spreading evenly across the floor. I stared at it as though it had committed a personal betrayal. "No," I said softly, "we don't do that." The heater continued working. I laughed once, short and uneasy, then set my bag down. Outside the window, traffic lines traced patient arcs through the dark. Ships departed, arrived, adjusted course by margins too small to register consciously. I watched them longer than usual, wondering how many adjustments the universe made every second that no one ever noticed. Her voice returned to me without invitation. "You will not finish that." It hadn't been a guess. It hadn't even been confidence. It had been settled, as though the outcome already existed and she was simply acknowledging it. My comm chimed. The sound startled me more than it should have. I hadn't given anyone new access. I hadn't requested contact. The channel identifier was blank, not hidden, not encrypted, simply absent, like a space where information refused to form. I hesitated, then accepted. Text appeared clean and unadorned. "You acted without expectation." I read it twice. "That seems to be the theme of the day," I said, unsure whether speaking mattered. Another line followed. "Expectation distorts outcomes." I exhaled slowly. "You're saying I did something important." A pause, longer than before. Important things are rarely loud. I leaned against the counter, the heater humming behind me like a witness that refused to testify. "Is she all right?" I asked. The response came quickly. "She is precisely where she must be." That didn't answer anything, which felt intentional. "Who are you?" I asked. Another pause. When the text returned, it was shorter. "Observers, plural." I didn't like that. Before I could type another question, the channel closed. No farewell, no reassurance, just absence, sharp and deliberate. I stood there in the quiet, feeling something settle into place inside me. Not fear, not excitement, but awareness. The uncomfortable sense of having been seen clearly and found usable. That night, sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of hands adjusting constellations the way technicians adjust instruments, with patience and care. I dreamed of doors opening not because they were forced, but because someone on the other side had decided it was time. When I woke, the heater was still working. I stared at it for a long moment before turning away. Somewhere far beyond the station, beyond the neat lanes of traffic and the polite geometry of civilization, I knew she was moving through systems that bent when she passed. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough. And I was left with the unsettling certainty that my small, unremarkable choice had. The summons came without sound. I noticed it only because everything else stopped insisting on my attention. The heater, loyal to its new and suspicious personality, fell silent. The distant traffic hum softened, as if the station had decided to hold its breath. Even my comm, usually restless with alerts and reminders, went dark. That was when the air changed. Not temperature, not pressure, intent. I stood by the window, hands wrapped around a mug I had already finished, watching the stars with the uncomfortable awareness that they were no longer indifferent. Somewhere beyond the neat choreography of arrival lanes, something vast had shifted its focus. Not toward the station, toward me. The first vibration rolled through the floor seconds later. Subtle, controlled, nothing like an emergency, more like a correction. I felt it in my bones rather than my feet, a precise adjustment that reminded me of the woman's voice, calm, assured, never raising itself to demand attention. For consequences, I dressed slowly, deliberately. If this was going to escalate, I refused to meet it half awake and unbalanced. The mirror reflected a person who looked exactly as ordinary as yesterday, which felt increasingly dishonest. No marks, no symbols, just a human who had given away lunch and somehow altered the margins of probability. When I stepped into the corridor, the lights activated ahead of me in a smooth, anticipatory sequence. Doors opened without delay. No one else was present, though it was a time of day when there should have been at least some foot traffic. The station hadn't evacuated. It had cleared space. The lift waited with its doors already open. I stopped several steps short. "I didn't agree to this," I said to the empty corridor. The lift chimed once. Patient, I stepped inside. As we descended, the display panel didn't show levels. Instead, it displayed a slow, steady pulse, concentric rings expanding outward. Not information, a signal. The pressure in my chest eased slightly, as if the lift itself were moderating my stress. When the doors opened, I wasn't on any public deck. The chamber beyond was vast, circular, and unadorned. No banners, no insignia, the kind of place that didn't need to announce authority because authority had already decided it belonged there. The ceiling arched high above, threaded with faint lines of light that shifted subtly, mapping something I couldn't interpret. And she was there. She stood near the center of the chamber, hands folded behind her back, posture relaxed but absolute. The long ears were unmistakable now, no longer hidden by crowd and distraction. In the open space, they marked her clearly as something other than human, yet nothing about her felt exaggerated or alien. If anything, she seemed more grounded than the room itself. "You arrived," she said, as if this were a mild curiosity rather than an inevitability. "You arranged that," I replied. "Yes." I exhaled slowly. "You could have warned me." "You would have prepared," she said. "Preparation would have altered the outcome." I almost laughed. "Almost. You really don't like expectation, do you?" She regarded me for a long moment. "Expectation is how lesser powers comfort themselves." That sentence landed with weight. "Then what are you?" I asked. She stepped closer, not into my space, but into relevance. "I am a governor," she said, "not of territory, of alignment." "That's not clearer." "It is not meant to be," she replied calmly. Around us, the chamber's lights shifted, responding to her presence. Not reacting, anticipating. I felt suddenly, vividly aware of how small my life had been until now, not insignificant but narrow, constrained by assumptions I hadn't known were optional. "You shared your food," she said. "You did not ask for identity, allegiance, or return. You acted as if the moment mattered more than the result." "It was lunch," I said weakly. "It was choice," she corrected, "at a point where outcomes were undecided." I swallowed, and that changed something. "Yes, how much?" She smiled faintly. Not triumph, not amusement, recognition. "Enough." The floor beneath us shimmered, and the stars outside the chamber, visible now through a field I hadn't noticed before, shifted minutely. Routes adjusted, timelines corrected, not violently, elegantly. "You control the stars," I said quietly. "I influence the systems that decide where they may burn without destroying what lies between," she answered. "Control is a human word. I prefer stewardship." I thought of the child, the quiet certainty, the way he had stood between me and forces I hadn't known were there. "The boy," I said, "he was." "A bridge," she finished, "and a test." I felt a flash of anger then, sharp and unexpected. "You used him." She didn't flinch. "I protected him," she said, "from those who would have turned him into a symbol instead of a person." The anger dulled, replaced by something heavier. Understanding, maybe, or resignation. "And me?" I asked. "What am I?" She looked at me with full attention now, and the chamber seemed to lean in with her. "You are a variable," she said, "one that has proven stable." "That doesn't sound comforting." It is the highest compliment I offer. Silence settled between us, not empty but complete. I realized then that nothing dramatic was going to happen. No declaration, no explosion, no sudden elevation to importance. That was never her way. She turned slightly, gaze moving past me toward futures I couldn't see. "You will return to your life," she said. "It will appear unchanged." "And it won't be." "No," she agreed, "it will not." I hesitated. "Will I see you again?" She considered the question carefully. "If the stars require recalibration," she said, "and if you remain who you are." She stepped back. When I returned to the station's ordinary levels, nothing announced my arrival. No alarms, no gathered crowds, no sense that I had just stood in the presence of something that adjusted the movement of stars with the same ease I adjusted my coat collar. The corridor lights behaved. The floor panels responded normally. A pair of technicians argued quietly near a maintenance hatch about whose shift it really was. Life, it seemed, had decided to continue. That unsettled me more than any dramatic aftermath could have. I walked without destination at first, letting the station guide me the way it always had. Past transit hubs, through narrow service corridors, into public areas where people pretended the universe was predictable because schedules told them so. I watched faces, tired, distracted, hopeful, irritated, and wondered how many of them were unknowingly benefiting from alignments made far beyond their awareness. How many fragile futures had been nudged out of catastrophe by decisions they would never hear about. And how easily I might have walked past a woman in a cafeteria and never known. The thought followed me home. My apartment welcomed me with familiar smells and quiet persistence. The heater hummed softly, steady as a promise it intended to keep. I set my bag down and stood in the center of the room, suddenly unsure what people did after learning that the universe ran, at least in part, on discretion rather than force. I laughed under my breath. "You go on," I told myself. "That's what you do." So I did. Days passed, then weeks. On the surface, my life returned to its usual shape. Work resumed its dull rhythm. Tasks completed themselves when given attention. Systems stopped resisting me, not obeying, not favoring, just cooperating. It was as if friction had been reduced by a fraction so small no one else noticed, yet large enough to change how exhaustion settled in my bones. I slept better. I listened more. I found myself hesitating before small decisions, not out of fear, but out of awareness. The sense that even unremarkable moments carried weight when treated with care. When someone asked for help, I considered it fully before answering. When I declined, I did so honestly. Expectation alters outcomes. I began to understand what that meant. One evening, back in the cafeteria, I chose the same narrow table near the viewport. Not because I hoped she would return, but because it felt appropriate to remember where things had shifted. I ate slowly, finished my meal, watched the stars without asking them for anything. A maintenance worker nearby complained about a broken dispenser. I stood, helped him reset it, and sat back down without comment. He thanked me like it mattered more than it should have. It did. The message arrived on an unmarked channel late one night, quiet and precise. Alignment remained stable. I read it twice, then set the comm aside. There was no surge of excitement this time, no tightness in my chest. Just a calm acknowledgement, like hearing that a distant storm had passed without incident. Another message followed, hours later. "The child continues to ask questions." I smiled despite myself. "Good," I said to the empty room. "He should." I wondered if he remembered the cafeteria, if he remembered the taste of food that was merely sufficient, offered without ceremony. I hoped he did, not as a lesson but as a reference point. Proof that power did not have to announce itself to be real. As the months went on, I noticed something else. People around me changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but conversations softened. Arguments ended earlier. Decisions leaned just slightly toward restraint instead of dominance. I knew better than to take credit for it. That wasn't how stewardship worked. but I recognized the pattern. Small adjustments, quiet corrections, the kind that last. Sometimes, late at night, I stood by the window and looked up at the stars. They no longer felt indifferent, not attentive exactly, but responsive like an old system that had finally been tuned correctly. I thought of her then, of the way she stood without tension, certain without arrogance. Stewardship, not control. I never saw her again, not directly. But occasionally in crowded places I caught glimpses, someone pausing at just the right moment, a decision deferred, a conflict dissolving before it could harden. The universe, it turned out, left fingerprints everywhere once you knew how to look. One morning the heater failed. I stared at it, startled by the return of normal frustration. Then I laughed, long and genuine, because somehow that felt right too. Even aligned systems were allowed to break. Repair was part of the process. As I fixed it, hands dirty, breath fogging in the cold, I realized something simple and grounding. I hadn't been chosen. I hadn't been elevated. I hadn't been rewarded. I had been noticed and then left alone, trusted to continue being exactly who I was. That more than anything felt like respect. The stars still burned. Ships still traveled. Empires still argued quietly in chambers far from public view. But somewhere within that vast machinery, restraint had a voice and discretion had a presence. And once, in a cafeteria filled with noise and impatience, that presence had accepted a simple